The rain hammered against the rusted helmets, thunder rumbling over the ravaged hills of Okinawa. It was a pitch-black night, soaked and heavy with the stench of mud, decay, and fear. A cluster of Japanese women huddled beneath a tarp, barely large enough for half of them. When the American guards approached, their boots squelching in the mire, every hushed word vanished. The interpreter's voice trembled as he delivered the message. Asterisk. You will sleep in the graves you dug. Asterisk. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The words lingered in the air like smoke. Some wondered if it was a dark joke. Others feared it was a death sentence. Then one guard gestured toward the open pits behind them, shallow trenches dug just hours earlier. A flash of lightning revealed rainwater gathering inside them, dark and still as mirrors. One young woman, barely in her 20s, gripped her sister's arm. Asterisk. They want us to die here. Asterisk, she whispered. An older woman beside her murmured back. Asterisk. Then we die quietly. Asterisk. But as the guards repeated the order, their tone wasn't cruel. It was cold, deliberate. Asterisk. Lie down. Keep your heads low. Asterisk. The women obeyed. The sky split with thunder, mud seeping into their ears. The air reeked of rot and gun oil. Records suggest that over 3,000 Japanese civilians were captured on Okinawa that spring, more than 200 of them women. Most had never seen an American up close. Tonight, they would not just see them, they would feel the ground shake beneath their authority. The pits weren't just graves, they were shelter. Snipers lurked on the cliffs, and stray shells could land at any moment. The Americans believed this was the safest place. The women thought it was a warning. Both were right, in their own ways. Lying in the dirt, one prisoner watched her breath fog in the frigid air. Asterisk. We thought this was how Americans buried their shame. Asterisk. She would later write in her diary. But that night, no one died. The rain poured until the world dissolved into gray. The sound of boots eventually faded. The night stretched on, and when dawn finally arrived, something unbelievable had happened. The women were still alive. The light didn't feel like morning. It felt like rebirth. They blinked through layers of dried mud, their hair stiff with rain, the trenches around them steaming in the pale morning air. No one dared to move at first. The silence was unnatural, no gunfire, no shouting, just the drip of water and the distant rumble of idling trucks. One by one, they realized the impossible. They had survived. Some laughed wildly. Others sobbed. A few just stared at the sky, murmuring that even the dead must envy them. The Americans stood nearby, their helmets catching the weak light. They didn't mock. They didn't apologize. One guard lit a cigarette, exhaled, and said flatly, Asterisk. See, you're safer there. Asterisk. That was all. No malice, no sympathy, just logic from men who had fought through hell and no longer trusted chance. Before the U.S. invasion, fewer than 1 in 10 captured Japanese civilians lived to see another day. Yet here, these women had made it through the night untouched. They weren't sure if it was mercy or strategy. Mud clung to them like a second skin. Their kimonos, once symbols of tradition, were ruined, ripped by shovels and jagged rocks. One woman whispered, Asterisk. We slept among the dead, yet we felt strangely safe. Asterisk. Another added, Asterisk. Maybe Americans fear ghosts. Asterisk. The idea spread like wildfire through the camp. By noon, rumors twisted the truth. Some claimed the soldiers had forced them into the graves as punishment. Others insisted it was for protection. The interpreter tried to clarify, but no one trusted words anymore. Language itself had lost its meaning. That night, when the guards returned, There were no new orders to dig, no fresh graves, only a warning to stay low if the artillery started again. Yet, as the women lay down on the cold earth, each of them glanced back at those trenches, those strange, shallow beds that had saved them. The mind adapts faster than the heart, and as fear began to fade, confusion took its place. What kind of enemy spares you by burying you alive? The next morning, a jeep rolled through the mud, its tires cutting through the camp's silence. Inside sat the American commander, a man in his 40s, his face worn more by exhaustion than cruelty. His uniform was immaculate, his gaze unreadable. The women stiffened instinctively, unsure whether to salute, hide, or pray. Through the interpreter, he spoke words that made even the guards pause. Asterisk. You were told to sleep in the graves for safety. Asterisk, he explained. Asterisk. Snipers can't shoot what they can't see. Asterisk. The statement felt absurd. Safety in a grave. But as he continued, the logic struck like cold rain. The night before, stray bullets had pinged through the valley. Had they stood, they might have been dead. The graves weren't punishment. They were cover. The commander pointed toward the ridge. Asterisk. We lost 12,500 men here. Asterisk, he said quietly, smoke curling from his cigarette. Asterisk. And 100,000 of your people. Asterisk, the translator added, his voice shaking. Numbers like that didn't feel real. They felt biblical. A former nurse among the women murmured, asterisk. He speaks of death like it's just weather. Asterisk, another whispered, asterisk. Or like someone who's seen too much of it. Asterisk. The officer turned away, leaving his half-smoked cigarette in the mud. To him, it was just an explanation. To the women, it was dissonance, an enemy who protected them, not out of pity, but calculation. They couldn't decide which was more unsettling, being hated or being shielded by those who had destroyed their homes. Later, as the guards handed out blankets, one soldier awkwardly offered a canteen of water. One woman refused. Another accepted, and in that small gesture, something invisible cracked. The wall between captor and captive, enemy and survivor, wavered. In her later testimony, one prisoner recalled, asterisk. He sounded almost protective, but in that moment, protection felt heavier than hatred, because mercy in war always comes with a question mark. Asterisk. As the sun dipped behind the ridges, painting the sky in orange and smoke, the women settled into their makeshift shelters, whispering the same thought. Asterisk. Why would they keep us alive? Asterisk. And as the smell of cooking rations drifted through the camp, the answer began to form, not in words, but in hunger. By the third morning, the scent came first. Salt, fat, and something almost sinful spam. Canned meat sizzling on metal trays, steam curling into the air. The women froze as the guards called them forward. They had expected punishment. Instead, they were handed spoons and soft white bread. It was the first real food they'd tasted in. Weeks warm, greasy, substantial. One woman stared at the can's label, tracing the English letters like strange poetry. Another took a bite and cried silently. It reminded her of festival food from before the war, the kind that vanished when rice became scarce. Records from Okinawa camps indicate that each prisoner received about 1,200 calories a day, nearly double what civilians in Japan got during those final starving months. White bread, canned beans, powdered milk, all luxuries they hadn't dreamed of. The guards called it basic sustenance. To the women, it was a moral puzzle. How could food taste this good when given by the enemy? At the mess tent, laughter rose from American troops nearby, the kind that comes with coffee and cigarettes. The women ate in silence, chewing guilt. One whispered, "Asterisk. We eat American food with tears of surrender." Asterisk. Another muttered, "Asterisk. Even our shame tastes foreign now." Asterisk. The interpreter tried to explain that sharing rations wasn't mockery, it was protocol. But no one believed him. Kindness from the victor always carries a shadow. Still, hunger overrides pride. By the second meal, the hesitation faded. The women lined up faster, murmuring quiet thanks in broken English. A sergeant gave extra bread to a woman with trembling hands. Asterisk. "You look like my sister." Asterisk, he said softly. She didn't understand the words, but she recognized the tone. Something human. That night, under the flicker of oil lamps, one of the younger women began whispering English prayers fragments from her missionary school days. A guard overheard and smiled. She looked away, pretending not to notice. War had turned enemies into providers, captives into guests, and guilt into survival. But in the dim light, the interpreter noticed something else. A woman tracing invisible letters in the air, mouthing words that weren't her own. Because what happens when compassion starts to sound like betrayal? Steam curled from the shower tent, like ghosts fleeing the war. The women lined up barefoot, trembling not from cold but disbelief. American medics barked instructions through translators. Asterisk. Take off your clothes. Wash. Scrub hard. Asterisk. For women who had hidden in caves for weeks, it felt like another kind of exposure. Yet, as the warm water hit their skin, something unexpected happened. They began to feel human again. Inside the makeshift bathhouse, soap slipped through their fingers, and laughter, genuine, startled laughter, echoed for the first time. One woman covered her face and whispered, "Asterisk. We are being treated better by our enemies than by our officers." Asterisk. And it was true. Before capture, Imperial soldiers had denied them medicine, even food. Here, Americans were disinfecting their wounds, checking temperatures, handing out clean blankets. Official records estimate that more than 60% of the women suffered from infections or parasites. The medics logged everything: lice counts, body temperatures, as if each life mattered. To the women, it felt like a strange mercy. Clinical, not emotional, but mercy all the same. One nurse adjusted her bandage, trying to hide her tears. Another prisoner muttered, "Asterisk. If this is defeat, why does it feel like relief?" Asterisk. The interpreter said nothing. He, too, looked confused, caught between duty and a moral shift, too vast to translate. After the baths came food inspections, haircuts, and clean khaki uniforms meant for civilians. The camp smelled of disinfectant and bread. The women's faces, once hollow, began to regain color, but with every kindness came discomfort. Every smile from a medic reminded them of those who had died, believing Americans were monsters. That night, one woman sat near the camp fence, watching the guards smoke under the stars. She wondered if they missed their mothers, too. The same woman would later write, Asterisk. They treated us like patients, not prisoners. Asterisk. And among the rows of tents, one figure stood out. A young American medic who treated every wound as if it belonged to his sister. His gaze lingered on a wounded teacher from Naha. Neither spoke the other's language, but every gesture said the same thing. Asterisk, you're still alive. Asterisk. Night in the camp hummed with insects and the low murmurs of the wounded. Under the flicker of kerosene lamps, an American medic knelt beside a Japanese woman, her arm wrapped in filthy gauze, infection spreading fast. The interpreter stood nearby, translating each hesitant word. But tonight, language wasn't what mattered. It was tone. Asterisk. Easy. Asterisk, the medic said, cleaning the wound. The woman winced, but didn't pull away. His hands were steady, gloved, precise. War had turned him into a machine of triage, but her eyes wide, fearful, grateful, reminded him he was still human. According to U.S. records, more than 40 Japanese women in Okinawa's prisoner camps needed immediate surgery. 6 lost limbs. Supplies were scarce, but medics treated them anyway. Saline made from rainwater, bandages torn from shirts, morphine doled out drop by drop. The interpreter, a university student from Kyoto, hesitated as he translated her whispered question. Asterisk. She asks why you help the enemy. Asterisk. The medic didn't look up. Asterisk. Rules are rules. Asterisk, he said quietly. Asterisk. We don't choose who bleeds. Asterisk. The interpreter didn't translate that line. He couldn't. Some truths shatter too easily when spoken in another tongue. When the procedure was done, the medic carefully tucked her arm under a blanket. Before leaving, he pulled a creased photograph from his pocket, a smiling woman and a small boy on a porch, far from this muddy island. He left it beside her stretcher, maybe by accident, maybe not. She stared at it long after he was gone. A smiling woman, a child, a home untouched by bombs. It didn't feel like propaganda. It felt like proof that kindness could survive, even in men trained to kill. Later that night, she whispered to the interpreter, Asterisk. He smiled when I flinched, like he understood. Asterisk. The translator didn't answer. He simply watched her trace the faces in the photo, her fingers trembling not from fever, but from something far more dangerous. Hope. Outside, the rain started again, tapping softly against the tent canvas. The photo's corner curled in the damp, and by dawn, it was already passing from one pair of hands to another. Because even in a camp built to divide, a single image could travel faster than orders. By sunrise, the photograph had become legend, passed hand to hand like contraband. A faded snapshot. An American woman in a floral dress, a toddler clutching her leg, sunlight on their porch steps. It showed no war, no hatred. It showed something everyone in that camp had forgotten existed. Normal life. The first woman who held it said it smelled faintly of tobacco and antiseptic. The next whispered, Asterisk. His wife looks happy. Why is he here? Asterisk. By the time it reached the 12th set of hands, it had changed meaning. It wasn't just his family anymore. It was proof that the enemy could still love. Inside the barracks, whispers turned into questions the interpreter couldn't answer. Asterisk. Could a man who smiled that way also drop bombs? Could someone with a child that small ever shoot without hesitation? Asterisk. Each woman looked at the photo, then at the guards, then back again. The world no longer made sense. Historical records note that the average American soldier in the Pacific was just 26 years old, and nearly 70% had families waiting at home. That fact hit harder than gunfire. These weren't faceless monsters. They were boys turned into weapons, missing the same things their prisoners dreamed of. That night, a guard caught them passing the photograph and ordered it confiscated. But instead of shouting, he simply said, Asterisk. Keep it quiet. Asterisk. Maybe he understood. Maybe he was just tired of pretending the world was simple. In the dim light, the women huddled together, tracing the faces in that tiny rectangle. Someone whispered, Asterisk. If this is the enemy's heart, maybe we never understood ours. Asterisk. The interpreter didn't translate that either. One nurse adjusted her bandage, trying to hide her tears. Another prisoner muttered, Asterisk. If this is defeat, why does it feel like relief? Asterisk. The interpreter said nothing. He, too, looked confused, caught between duty and a moral shift, too vast to translate. After the baths came food inspections, haircuts, and clean khaki uniforms meant for civilians. The camp smelled of disinfectant and bread. The women's faces, once hollow, began to regain color, but with every kindness came discomfort. Every smile from a medic reminded them of those who had died, believing Americans were monsters. That night, one woman sat near the camp fence, watching the guards smoke under the stars. She wondered if they missed their mothers, too. The same woman would later write, asterisk. They treated us like patients, not prisoners. Asterisk. And among the rows of tents, one figure stood out. A young American medic who treated every wound as if it belonged to his sister. His gaze lingered on a wounded teacher from Naha. Neither spoke the other's language, but every gesture said the same thing. Asterisk, you're still alive. Asterisk. Night in the camp hummed with insects and the low murmurs of the wounded. Under the flicker of kerosene lamps, an American medic knelt beside a Japanese woman, her arm wrapped in filthy gauze, infection spreading fast. The interpreter stood nearby, translating each hesitant word. But tonight, language wasn't what mattered. It was tone. Asterisk. Easy. Asterisk, the medic said, cleaning the wound. The woman winced, but didn't pull away. His hands were steady, gloved, precise. War had turned him into a machine of triage, but her eyes wide, fearful, grateful, reminded him he was still human. According to U.S. records, more than 40 Japanese women in Okinawa's prisoner camps needed immediate surgery. 6 lost limbs. Supplies were scarce, but medics treated them anyway. Saline made from rainwater, bandages torn from shirts, morphine doled out drop by drop. The interpreter, a university student from Kyoto, hesitated as he translated her whispered question. Asterisk. She asks why you help the enemy. Asterisk. The medic didn't look up. Asterisk. Rules are rules. Asterisk, he said quietly. Asterisk. We don't choose who bleeds. Asterisk. The interpreter didn't translate that line. He couldn't. Some truths shatter too easily when spoken in another tongue. When the procedure was done, the medic carefully tucked her arm under a blanket. Before leaving, he pulled a creased photograph from his pocket, a smiling woman and a small boy on a porch, far from this muddy island. He left it beside her stretcher, maybe by accident, maybe not. She stared at it long after he was gone. A smiling woman, a child, a home untouched by bombs. It didn't feel like propaganda. It felt like proof that kindness could survive, even in men trained to kill. Later that night, she whispered to the interpreter, Asterisk. He smiled when I flinched, like he understood. Asterisk. The translator didn't answer. He simply watched her trace the faces in the photo, her fingers trembling not from fever, but from something far more dangerous. Hope. Outside, the rain started again, tapping softly against the tent canvas. The photo's corner curled in the damp, and by dawn, it was already passing from one pair of hands to another. Because even in a camp built to divide, a single image could travel faster than orders. By sunrise, the photograph had become legend, passed hand to hand like contraband. A faded snapshot. An American woman in a floral dress, a toddler clutching her leg, sunlight on their porch steps. It showed no war, no hatred. It showed something everyone in that camp had forgotten existed. Normal life. The first woman who held it said it smelled faintly of tobacco and antiseptic. The next whispered, asterisk, His wife looks happy. Why is he here? Asterisk. By the time it reached the 12th set of hands, it had changed meaning. It wasn't just his family anymore. It was proof that the enemy could still love. Inside the barracks, whispers turned into questions the interpreter couldn't answer. Asterisk. Could a man who smiled that way also drop bombs? Could someone with a child that small ever shoot without hesitation? Asterisk. Each woman looked at the photo, then at the guards, then back again. The world no longer made sense. Historical records note that the average American soldier in the Pacific was just 26 years old, and nearly 70% had families waiting at home. That fact hit harder than gunfire. These weren't faceless monsters. They were boys turned into weapons, missing the same things their prisoners dreamed of. That night, a guard caught them passing the photograph and ordered it confiscated. But instead of shouting, he simply said, asterisk. Keep it quiet. Asterisk. Maybe he understood. Maybe he was just tired of pretending the world was simple. In the dim light, the women huddled together, tracing the faces in that tiny rectangle. Someone whispered, asterisk. If this is the enemy's heart, maybe we never understood ours. Asterisk. The interpreter didn't translate that either. Some sentences aren't meant to survive in two languages. When the storm rolled in later that night, the photo was still on the dirt floor, half buried under a tin cup. The rain came hard, seeping through the canvas, soaking everything. By dawn, the picture was gone, swallowed by mud, lost like the truth itself. But the story of it would endure, because in a place built to strip away identity, a single photograph had reminded them what being human looked like. That night, the sky split open like a curse. The wind howled across Okinawa, ripping through tents, flipping canvas, dragging buckets through the mud. The first raindrop fell like a warning. Within minutes, it was a deluge. The women clutched their blankets as thunder rolled down from the cliffs, the same cliffs that had swallowed entire families months earlier. The storm didn't care. It drowned the lamps, swallowed their whispers, and turned the earth into sludge. The trenches, the same ones they had once slept in, began to fill again. Water pooled around their feet, cold and relentless. Soon, the pits started collapsing. Mud walls caved in. The smell of decay returned. Guards shouted over the downpour, their flashlights cutting through the rain. Some tried to secure the tents. Others dragged the weakest women to higher ground. But the storm didn't care who wore what uniform. It leveled everything equally. Eyewitness accounts described the 1,945 Okinawa typhoon as one of the worst winds, nearing 140 miles per hour. It tore supply lines, sank ships, and erased entire camps overnight. For these women, it was a nightmare reborn, buried once by men, now by nature. One woman screamed as the ground gave way beneath her. Another fell into the same trench she'd slept in days before. The mud clung to her like a memory. Asterisk. The earth is taking us back. Asterisk. Someone shouted. Then hands. Rough, foreign, human. An American guard pulled her free, gasping, covered in sludge. She looked at him through the rain and saw the same terror in his eyes. In that chaos, the lines between captor and captive blurred. They were just bodies, fighting a storm too vast to hate. The interpreter later wrote, asterisk, we fought the wind together that night. For a few hours, war was suspended. Asterisk, by dawn, the camp was unrecognizable. Trenches flooded, fences down, uniforms indistinguishable under layers of mud. But as the sun rose, something glinted in the light. Bones pale and half exposed where the graves had collapsed. The storm had unearthed a new horror, something buried that refused to stay silent. The camp fell into a silence so heavy it felt staged. The air smelled of diesel, mud, and something older. Something that turned the stomach before the mind understood. As the women and soldiers cleared the wreckage, a shout came from the southern fence. A woman had slipped, her hands sinking into soft earth, not rock, but bone. The rain had peeled back the island's history. Pale shapes emerged, ribs, helmets, fabric clinging to skeletons. Someone screamed. Someone else fell to their knees. It wasn't the enemy this time. It was kin. By mid-morning, the truth spread through the camp like smoke. These weren't old graves from before the occupation. They were fresh Japanese soldiers, some barely 18, buried hastily during the final siege months earlier. A tag glinted on one body. A woman recognized the family name, her brother. Her voice cracked like the sky had again. Post-war reports estimate that nearly 20,000 bodies remained missing across southern Okinawa. The storm had given back a few, and each one carried a story that refused to stay buried. The American guards didn't know what to do. They stood at the edge of the trench, helmets off, boots sinking in mud. One sergeant, his face unreadable, knelt and brushed mud from a skull. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The women watched, expecting scorn. Instead, they saw restraint, reverence. The interpreter wrote later, asterisk. We stopped being two sides that morning. For a few hours, we were just witnesses. The camp fell into wordless order. Blankets covered the remains. The smell of decay mixed with the sweetness of wet earth. No one ate that day. No one argued. One American whispered to another, asterisk. They deserve a burial, asterisk. The other nodded, asterisk. Orders or not, they knew. Asterisk. And as the women stood shoulder to shoulder with their captors, watching shovels dig again, they realized something unsettling. Respect had replaced hatred, and that was somehow harder to bear. By dusk, the graves were ready, but this time, no one was forced inside. The afternoon sun hung low, filtered through haze and wet dust. The camp was silent, except for the rhythmic scrape of shovels. Japanese women and American soldiers worked side by side, not speaking, not needing to. What had been a battlefield now looked like a ceremony waiting for permission. The American sergeant, in charge, a broad man with mud on his sleeves and a tremor in his voice, finally gave the order. Asterisk. Form ranks. Asterisk. No bark, no threat, just quiet command. His men lined up by the trench, rifles in hand, bayonets sheathed. The women stood opposite, heads bowed. Between them lay the uncovered remains of their own. When the first rifle shot cracked, it wasn't the sound of victory. It was respect. A second. A third. The echo rolled through the valley like thunder, delayed by history. A folded American flag was placed beside the nearest body. Not as ownership, but acknowledgement. Official U.S. Records confirm that over 1,000 Japanese soldiers were reburied by American troops in Okinawa during 1945. Each burial wasn't a gesture of friendship, but a small rebellion against the madness of war. Even the victors needed moments to feel human again. The women didn't understand the spoken words of the ceremony, but they understood the tone. Reverence sounds the same in every language. Some wept. Others watched. Frozen. The interpreter whispered asterisk. They honor your dead like their own. Asterisk. One woman whispered back. Asterisk. Then maybe they mourn their souls too. Asterisk. As the final volley fired, the air stilled. The sergeant saluted the trench hand to helmet, chin high, eyes forward. When he dropped his arm, the spell broke. Work resumed, but something invisible had shifted. Later, a woman approached the sergeant, clutching a scrap of cloth from her brother's uniform. She didn't bow. She didn't speak. She just placed it in his hand. He nodded once, tucking it into his pocket as if it were his own burden. The guards returned to their posts, the women to their tents. But that night, no one slept easily, because rumors had begun to spread of transport lists, of ships heading east, of something the Americans called repatriation. The graves were sealed, the salutes faded, but whispers never stopped. By early October, the Okinawa camp was thick with a new kind of tension. Not fear of bullets, but fear of freedom. The interpreter brought news that spread like wildfire. Some prisoners might soon be sent home. Asterisk home? Asterisk. The word landed differently on each face. For some, it meant reunion. For others, interrogation. None knew what awaited them across the sea. They'd seen what happened to surrendered soldiers, names erased, families shamed. What would Japan do with women who had lived under American roofs, eaten American food? One woman, the former teacher, asked quietly, asterisk, "If we go home, will we still be prisoners?" Asterisk. The interpreter had no answer. Official records show that Japan formally surrendered on the 2nd of September 1945, and by late October, the U.S. began organizing prisoner repatriation through Okinawa. But inside the camp, nothing was official, only rumor and dread. The women gathered at night, whispering under canvas flaps. Asterisk, maybe they'll trade us. Asterisk, one said. Asterisk, maybe they'll drown us halfway. Asterisk, another muttered. Fear had become routine, and even kindness felt like camouflage. An American sergeant noticed the shift. Asterisk, they should be happy. Asterisk, he said, frowning. Asterisk, they're going home. Asterisk. But a medic replied softly. Asterisk, maybe they're not sure where that is anymore. Asterisk. The next morning, the women were told to prepare personal belongings. For most, that meant nothing more than scraps, a comb, a torn handkerchief, a prayer charm. But a few began making something unexpected. Small paper cranes, folded from ration slips, notebook pages, even cigarette wrappers. Not as gifts, not as protest, just as a way to keep their hands busy while waiting for truth to arrive. The interpreter watched them work, delicate fingers folding memory into shape. He asked one why she bothered. She smiled faintly. Asterisk. Because even paper can survive the wind. When night fell, the cranes hung in rows above their bunks, hundreds of them, white against the dark canvas, trembling with every breeze. And as the Americans posted new orders on the command tent wall, one word stood out in bold ink. Asterisk departure. Asterisk. Morning arrived soft and gray. The kind of light that hides emotion. The camp was unnaturally still, as if the world had paused to breathe before goodbye. Over 200 Japanese women stood in line, each holding something fragile. A paper crane, folded from ration slips, medical logs, even cigarette wrappers. The air smelled faintly of soap and damp cloth. When the American sergeant called roll, no one spoke out of turn. Each name, each number, echoed off the metal roofs like a heartbeat counting down. The interpreter translated mechanically, but his voice cracked when he reached the teacher's name. She stepped forward, bowing slightly, crane in hand. Then, quietly, the women began moving row by row toward the guards. Each offered a paper bird, head lowered. No speeches, no tears, just soft gestures of thanks. The guards didn't know what to do at first. Then one of them, the same medic who had treated their wounds weeks earlier, accepted his with both hands. Asterisk. For me? Asterisk, he asked. The interpreter nodded. Reports later confirmed that 213 Japanese women were repatriated from Okinawa by early 1946. But numbers could never measure what happened in that moment. Enemies exchanging symbols of peace under a sky still haunted by gun smoke. The cranes fluttered in the wind, wings trembling as if alive. To some Americans, it looked like surrender. To the women, it was something deeper. Closure. For the first time since capture, they controlled the meaning of their own act. One woman approached the medic and pressed something folded between her fingers. When he opened it later, it wasn't just a crane. Inside, wrapped tight, was a photograph. The same one that had vanished during the storm. His wife, his son, still smiling through the creases. She had kept it safe through rain, sickness, and fear. And now she was giving it back. No words, just a bow. He watched her walk away toward the trucks, cranes dangling from her belt like talismans. Engines roared, dust rose. The camp's fences opened for the first time. The wind carried the last of the cranes upward, scattering them across the mud and sky. And somewhere in that swirl of paper and silence, mercy looked a lot like redemption. The sea was gray, endless, and quiet, the kind of quiet that carries ghosts. The women stood on the deck of the transport ship, wrapped in thin blankets, faces pale against the wind. Below them, engines rumbled steadily, pushing the vessel toward the Japanese coast. Home was somewhere beyond the mist, but no one dared to call it that yet. The medic watched from the pier as the ship pulled away. In his hand, the paper crane she'd given him had started to crumble at the edges. He didn't unfold it. Some things aren't meant to be opened again. Inside the ship, the women sat in rows, their silence heavier than the cargo. The interpreter, now assigned to escort them, noted how none looked back toward Okinawa. They'd spent too long in graves, too long being told what they were. Going home meant facing the question of who they'd become. Historical records state that more than 6,400 prisoners passed through Okinawa's camps between 1,945 and 1,946. Most went home quietly, unmentioned in headlines. But these women were different. They carried a paradox memories of mercy from the hands of their conquerors. At night, the ship's lights flickered against the waves, and the ocean reflected their faces, half shadow, half light. The teacher, the one who'd returned the photo, pressed her forehead to the cold steel rail. Asterisk. Home feels smaller now. Asterisk, she whispered, not expecting an answer. Another woman leaned close. Asterisk. Maybe home isn't where we return. Maybe it's what we remember. Asterisk. The interpreter listened, translating in his head, but never aloud. Some truths lose strength when spoken too early. By the third day, the coastline appeared a thin line of land that once symbolized pride, now guilt, now relief. The women stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes wet not from emotion, but salt spray. One clutched the last remaining crane, its wings flattened by the sea wind. They didn't cheer, they didn't cry. They just stared, trying to recognize the shape of belonging. The ship's horn wailed low, mournful, final. Behind them, Okinawa faded into the horizon. Ahead, Japan waited like an unfinished sentence. And somewhere between those two shores, the memory of a grave under rain began to feel less like terror and more like rebirth. Tokyo, 1958. The war was a memory nobody wanted to name, but its ghost still lingered in people's throats. Inside a small community hall, a woman in her 50s adjusted her glasses, facing a young interviewer with a tape recorder. Her hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the weight of a story she'd carried alone for 13 years. Asterisk. They told us to sleep in our own graves. Asterisk, she began. Asterisk. And somehow that's what saved us. Asterisk. Her voice didn't waver. The room stayed still except for the hum of the recorder. She was one of the few who ever spoke publicly about that night. In Okinawa, the night when burial became refuge and enemies became human. Most of the other women never talked. Shame in post-war Japan had its own silent code. Better to forget than to explain survival. Out of nearly 200 repatriated women, less than 10% ever gave testimony. History reduced them to numbers. But the woman in that chair refused invisibility. She opened her old pouch, pulling out something wrapped in faded cloth. A photograph, cracked down the middle. An American woman, a child, a porch in sunlight. Asterisk. I kept this. Asterisk, she said softly. Asterisk, because it reminded me that mercy can come wearing the wrong uniform. Asterisk. The interviewer asked if she ever saw the medic again. She smiled faintly. Asterisk. No, but I think he lived. He was too kind to die. Asterisk. Rain tapped against the window, faint, steady. The same sound that had once drowned their screams in Okinawa's trenches. She looked toward it, eyes half closed. Asterisk. It wasn't the grave that terrified us. Asterisk, she whispered. Asterisk. It was waking up alive. Asterisk. Outside, children's laughter echoed from the street, a sound she hadn't heard during the war. Life had returned, messy and ungrateful. She folded the photograph back into its cloth and tucked it inside her sleeve, close to her heart. The tape clicked to a stop. The room stayed silent. And somewhere between memory and myth, that night in the rain became something more than survival. It became proof that even at the edge of horror, humanity sometimes digs its own grave just to find shelter inside.